Hello and welcome to the Rabid Atheist. I'm Ed Raby, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like, because the purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues and any issues related to those issues. A hearty shout out to the Rabyd Nation. Join the nation by hitting that subscribe button. And if you want to support the channel in a more tangible way, hit the join button, and your membership options that lead to citizenship in the Rabyd Nation will be presented to you. Excuse me. Today I want to round out Holy Week, and this video will drop on Good Friday, which there's nothing really good about it, but I want to talk about, and Friday videos tend to be this way. I don't work with an outline on Friday like I do with the rest of the videos. So a lot of people have commented on my Friday videos, it'd be better if I had a script. And I'm like, no, that kind of defeats the point. The point of Fridays is to kind of speak on a topic that's a little bit more closer to me and personal. And so I don't really use a script, but I do have kind of an outline in my head. I used to do this all the time when I was a pastor. And today I want to talk about how teaching the life of Christ contributed to my deconversion. And the reason I want to talk about this is I hit at it in my deconversion story. I recently did a whole, playlist of my deconversion story in a larger detail for 2023. I think I concluded that in December. And it's becoming the basis for my memoirs, my road to my deconversion memoirs that I'm writing. And, I'm looking at those videos and fleshing out even more details in the book, hopefully. But I hint in that series several times that teaching the life of Christ was very problematic for me, for my faith, and why it led, it was part of the contributing factors that led me to deconverting. Because the essential crux of Christianity is Christ. Is Jesus Christ. Okay, he is the central figure. His actions define the doctrines, the teachings, the theology, the understanding of life that Christians have. Okay, he is their hero. He is the pinnacle, the pillar, the foundation of all they do. Okay, Paul says as much. That no other foundation can be laid other than Christ Jesus. And so when I would teach the life of Christ, now I took the life of Christ in Bible college, and my problems with it started there, particularly when we get to the most holy of events, the resurrection. But also I began to look at the life of Christ and some of the claims about the Gospels and Jesus' life that didn't just started to not add up even back then. And when I started in the ministry, I started a Bible Institute where part of the teaching curriculum was the life of Christ. It was, the life of Christ is kind of freshman level biblical studies. Okay, they like to hit that one to lay a foundation, for all other biblical study methods. I think that's actually a bad idea. I think the life of Christ is a more complicated thing that should be kept for later. It's much easier to take a book, a single gospel, and analyze it, and then after analyzing all four Gospels, you put them together in the life of Christ. But, that's neither here nor there. Bible colleges like to do what they do. But as I studied it, and then later on I would teach it in my Bible Institute that I created. I was a Christian education director, and so I created this little Bible Institute, and our goal, me and the senior pastor's goal, was to create a credentialing process for the Assemblies of God. Basically, we would be teaching the Berean courses, the at-home courses that you could order and take and become a credentialed. What we were doing is we were adding the element of teaching those courses in a class and helping the student get through. And I was stuck with the biblical studies theology stuff because that was my field. And then my friend, who also is the senior pastor, would teach the practical ministry stuff, which was more his forte anyway. So we had a good tag team there as far as ministry was concerned. But the problem is I ended up teaching the life of Christ twice in the time that I ran that biblical institute. And both times the problems of the Gospels, the problems of the life of Christ just came out. And that happened again when I got my first church. I taught it then, same thing, got worse. When I got my second church, same thing, I taught Life of Christ, it got worse. And then when I got my final church, I taught Life of Christ fairly early on, and that kind of led me to the whole wrestling with faith because it got worse and worse to the point. So what was it about the life of Christ? What specifically, teaching it caused me to, led me to deconversion? How did that pull me down the deconversion path? Well, the first thing that becomes painfully obvious when you teach the life of Christ is some events in Jesus' life are very unreconcilable. Like the accounts are so different that there's just no way to get around that sort of avenue. One of the particular aspects of the life of Christ is the resurrection. Who first witnessed Jesus? Who saw him first? Who saw the empty tomb first? What significance did it have to them? All becomes very gobbled together because there's no clear consistency in any of the accounts, and Mark doesn't give you one. Okay, so it was so significant of an event that Mark, the guy who wrote the Gospel of Mark, whoever he was, it may not have been a guy named Mark, doesn't even include it. It's an add-on later, and we know it's an add-on, because it doesn't appear till later, and you can tell that some pious monk is taking the other Gospels and we're going to sketch that in. And the fact that it was edited is kind of problematic to me too, that somebody had to edit and put it in Mark, but it's not really there. And so once you got past that, you're looking at the three different accounts of the resurrection, and they're very, very different. Okay, they're not the same. There's a lot of similarity, that problem of this discontinuity of the events isn't as apparent when you stick within the outline of Mark, like from the teaching of John the Baptist to when Jesus is arrested and crucified. There's a lot of continuity there between all the Gospels in some respects, although John throws a lot of monkey wrench into the crucifixion, being consistent. But you can justify, and I was doing a lot of justification of why this didn't happen, but the birth narratives, they're very different and focus on different events, and then the resurrection stuff is just all over the place. And that's just, that's a minor thing, I suppose, compared to some of the other ones I'm going to talk about. But then I began to look into the origin of each gospel. And I ran into a quick problem really quickly in the fact that even the earliest texts that we have point to a writing well after the fact. Okay, like even if I grant that Mark is written 20 years later, that's 20 years of, stuff creeping into the story. And it would be alleviated if the writers of the Gospels actually told us who their sources were, but they don't. Okay, and a lot of people, this, was written by John, he's an eyewitness. Except there's a lot of questions as to whether it was written by John, okay? When you get the writing of John in the early 2nd century, and that's the best you can do, that kind of eliminates the lifespan of somebody. Now, there's a lot of justification at the end of John of how he lived so long and whatever, and that sounds like apologetics to me because he doesn't really identify himself. John becomes this, kind of mysterious figure, almost as mysterious as God at times, because he's writing, he doesn't put a birth narrative in, he doesn't put an ascension in, he doesn't put a lot of the elements that the other Gospels writers have. He goes rogue, and so he only has one account. One of the problematic things that I'll talk about in a minute is, the fact that it's not really 4 witnesses of the life of Jesus. It's 4 different accounts of the life of Jesus, and they vary, and sometimes they don't even touch the same event. But getting back to the idea of who wrote them, they're all anonymously written. None of the Gospels have this was written by Mark, or this was written by Matthew, or this was written by Luke. And so I'm like, okay, did these people really write these things? Well, got to shrug my shoulders. Don't know. And so I can't definitively say that these are eyewitness accounts. I can't definitively say that, in fact, there's a low probability of that. And so there's not a lot of good evidence that that Mark wrote Mark, or Matthew wrote Matthew, or Luke wrote Luke, or John wrote John. I'm like, and that got worse as time went by. Instead of scholarship giving us more and more evidence of who wrote these books, it actually got more and more cloudy as I would look at it. And then the internet kind of opened this up where I was looking at this stuff and what are the criticisms of this book and so on and so forth. And then it came to the question of where did they get the stories? You see, here's the problem. Let's take one event in the life of Jesus, any event. Okay, let's pick one. Let's pick, Peter, told by Jesus to go grab a fishing pole, drop a fish in, and then pull out a fish, and there's 2 coins in it to pay the temple tax, the whole temple tax thing. Where did that story come from? Who told that story first? Who saw that story? And you could do this with every event in the life of Christ, regardless of gospel. That's why I'm not giving a gospel quote here. Take any story about Jesus. Where did that come from? Okay, so this is why the Gospels are hearsay. Okay, we really don't know who wrote them. And every single story in a Gospel, we don't have a source for. These are stories that were being told about Jesus by the believers. And these Gospel writers began to collect the stories and put them in a book. Luke is kind of telling you what he's doing, but it's not, Christians like to make a big deal about the fact that it seemed fitting for me also to put an order or account kind of thing. Well, all he's admitting to is that he's trying to put an order to the stories. He's trying to put them into a narrative form. He has all these stories being told about Jesus, and it's confusing. So he's trying to get rid of the confusion by putting them in an ordered account, the stories that he has personally heard. The problem is, he doesn't tell us where the stories came from, probably because he didn't know either. Okay, and he was just hearing stories from Christians. Okay, and if he wrote down the sources that he got those stories from, he would begin to realize, okay, this is second, third, fourth hand. Sorry, that's hearsay. By definition, it's hearsay and unadmissible in court. In short, all the stories about Jesus could be made up. They could have been made up by the Christians as they're sitting around the campfire saying stuff. And there's a video I react to, but there would be people around and say, well, that didn't happen, I was there. There's not enough people that would have witnessed these events that could have gone around to stop all the stories as Christianity begins to spread. And by the time they're written down, it's been at least, if I even grant the most conservative estimate for Mark, it's been 2 decades of people telling stories. And there's no way that all the witnesses of the events could have been there and raised their finger to object for all the times the story is told. Eventually, you're going to get the problem where even the witness of the events who knows that event that you're talking about is bullshit, okay, what they're going to throw their hands up in frustration, because this happens all the time in humanity, where a story gets told and retold so quickly that the actual witnesses of the event, who know that parts of the story that's being told is bullshit, can't do anything about it. It gets beyond their control. And I think that's what happened with the life of Jesus. It's a growing legend. When everybody had an objection, maybe the disciples stole the body. All of a sudden the story comes out, oh, no, the guards were bribed to keep that silence, that there was a miraculous event and they were told to keep that silent. And what you see in the Gospels is this early attempt at apologetics, where they know some of the stories are BS, and so they don't have any verification or whatever, and so they create narrative to answer the questions to those stories. And it became very clear to me that this is what it was. And it became even worse when I got outside the canonical Gospels, the big 4, and started looking at the other Gospels, and I started to put them in chronological order, the best we know. And I suddenly realized that the early Gospels just have the teachings of Jesus. And what that spoke to me at that point, okay, we have a revered teacher whose teachings, but not his life, are being preserved. And so at that point, I'm like, okay, do we have a teacher who's revered, whose life is being preserved? And then somewhere along the line, narrative starts to get added, and stories about this person get added. And by the time a lot of the stories are added, it's been a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, where the stories are just being told among Christians. This is not a good way to do history. Okay, it's not a good way to do anything, because you're basically allowing for all kinds of hearsay and made up stories and whatever to be added to the chronicle. And then I began to look at, is there any historical evidence at all that backs up this event? Is there anybody out there that contemporary to Jesus that writes about Jesus and verifies some of the events? No. Zero. None. And I suddenly realized that this could be a great work of fiction. This whole life narrative of Jesus could be just a fictional narrative, as fictional as Hercules, as fictional as Perseus, as fictional as all the other stories of great heroes. And it was that realization that made me realize this is no better a narrative than any other narrative of mythology. There's no evidence for it. Now, of course, that leads to a couple discussion points this week. I've had a couple commenters, well, the lack of evidence doesn't prove anything. It's not that significant. Really, the lack of evidence for something isn't significant. Well, let's deal with that appeal, and then we'll get back to the life of Jesus. If the lack of evidence for something isn't that significant, then a lot of things that we do in human life don't make a hell of a lot of sense. Let's start with some basic cognitive decisions that we make all the time. Let's say I'm fond of a certain hamburger place. It's got good hamburgers and everything else. And as I go in there, I read the menu, and there's no evidence that they serve pizza. Okay, they don't have it on the menu. I don't smell any pizza being cooked. It's a hamburger joint. Then one day I say, I don't care that there's no evidence that they don't serve pizza. I'm going to walk in there and order a pizza anyway, and I'm going to take it on faith that I'm going to get a pizza. I'd be an idiot. Okay? And that's just a simple example. Let's move on to a few others. Let's say I'm in procurement for a company. I'm involved in a real estate company, and I procure properties for this company. My job is to buy them, and then we assess their value, things like that. So down the road, if they have added value or added potential, I'm looking for that. And I see a piece of property that has real good potential. And as I'm inquiring, somebody comes forward and says, I own that property. Oh, okay, well, let's talk deal. And they give me a price, and I do a counter offer, and we go further in the deal. And then all of a sudden I realize there's no evidence that the person actually owns the property, so I ask for it. And the guy said, oh, well, you don't need evidence that I own the property. I know there's a lack of evidence that I own the property, but that's not significant. You just need to take it on faith that I own the property. I'm sorry, a lack of evidence would indicate to me that maybe I'm dealing with a fraud. Okay, that's a significant thing, that a lack of evidence is dealing with a fraud. Let's do a bigger one, more significant to a human life, being in court. Okay? This idea of this lack of evidence isn't significant is akin to a prosecutor getting up and going, well, we have no evidence that our client is guilty of murder. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard no evidence from us that he is actually guilty of anything. Okay? He's not acquainted with the victim. He has no motive to kill the victim. There's no evidence that the person that we're accusing of this crime is, even involved in any way with the victim at all. There's no evidence. The fingerprints on the weapon aren't his. He has an alibi where he's somewhere else completely. It's airtight. There's actual witnesses that he was somewhere else. But, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we really believe that this person is the person that committed the crime, and we want you to take it on faith. Don't look at the lack of evidence. The lack of evidence that this person has committed the crime isn't significant. We just want you to take it on faith that he actually committed the crime. And this has kind of gone, I think there's an apologetics move right now where they don't have any evidence, so they're trying to justify the lack of evidence as insignificant. It is significant. I'll get back to the life of Christ in a minute. Because this has gone into like, well, what if we have a God that is, using his power and his might, that he's mysterious and he, we don't have any evidence for his existence because that's the way he wants it. What the hell good is such a God? And wouldn't the evidence for such a God be atheists? That people don't believe in him? That he's really doing a good job of hiding his existence to the point that most of us don't believe in him? That would be seemingly indicative of such a God. And what use would such a God have? He can't reveal himself because that would be blowing his cover. He's trying to be mysterious, deliberately hiding his existence. He can't create anything. He certainly can't do miracles. He can't do anything. He's an absolutely useless God. He would not be a God because even if he has all power, he's not using it except to hide his existence. Okay? And this goes back to the idea of no evidence not being significant. The fact is, in science, if we are testing different postulates, like say we want to know what causes something, and we have A, B, C, and D as possible causes, and we start testing all of these possible causes, and we have some evidence for A, and we have more evidence for B, and we have a little bit of evidence for C, but none whatsoever for D. What would the scientists do at that point? They drop D, and they go back and retest for A, C, and A, B, but they know the lack of evidence for D, they now know that has a very low probability of being the cause. The point of the matter is, on a daily life basis, the lack of evidence is significant to us because we make major life decisions about people's lives based on the lack of evidence. The lack of evidence becomes a significant factor in every decision we make. Even as mundane as going into a hamburger joint and ordering pizza and that being stupid because there's no evidence that they serve pizza there. It should register in our brain as a significant thing. And when I get back to the life of Jesus and we have this lack of evidence of who wrote these Gospels, where these different stories came from, there's no evidence. Who's the source? Who, what? Oh, but Jesus being alive after that was witnessed by 500 people. Who? What are their names? Did they write down that they did this? Or are the apostles just making up a number? See, the problem with the way the Gospels are written and the way even Paul talks about the resurrection is it's hearsay. It has a low degree of probability. And that means that it has a low probability of being true. That's the significance of a lack of evidence or no evidence. You can't prove the truth of anything with a lack of evidence, and that's the significance. If you want to prove something, you have to have evidence. And I really feel like this motion down this road, and I'm tying this in with the life of Christ for a reason, because the life of Jesus Christ is purely for the Bible tells you so. There's no evidence of who wrote these Gospels, and there's no evidence where each individual story came from. It has a low probability of being true at that point, a low degree of certainty because of the lack of evidence. And I really feel that these days, because this is why I left the faith of Jesus, because there was no evidence for that Jesus was any different than Hercules or Perseus, okay? He's a hero, a heroic figure that's created, but easily as created as they are, okay? And so that's how it contributed to it. There's a lot of other factors that contributed to my deconversion, but this was a significant thing because Jesus was my hero when I was a kid. And then I found out that my hero worship of this character was no better than somebody who thought highly of, some hero of other ancient antiquity, some heroic god or demigod, and, liked the character of him. So it became a question of literature. and whether or not this character was any good, but I don't think he is. I think, I know the mythicists have their points. I agree. There isn't a lot of evidence for the existence of Jesus, but there is a little bit. And it doesn't take much to prove the existence of somebody. That's a very mundane historical claim. So I'm going to grant that Jesus existed, but I think what happened was we had this beloved teacher who taught, who was kind of a radical in his teaching, maybe rubbed a few people the wrong way. And I'm still speaking in probabilistic terms because it could be that this is completely made up too. And so those religious leaders didn't like this guy. He was getting a popular following, and so they had him killed by the Romans. Very possible. That's political skullduggery at its finest. And he's buried in a mass grave, and suddenly Peter and a few other apostles have some post-traumatic, stress disorder related stuff where they see appearances of Jesus. This happens like when people die, I think it's 10 to 15% of people still have life after death experiences with everybody. Very common thing when you consider it. And then they tell the stories to the rest of the, I saw Jesus alive, I saw Jesus alive. And all of a sudden this story begins to spread like wildfire, and they begin to tell other stories. And maybe some of these stories had some historical backing, but how would you ever find out now? You can't unravel it. And it seems to me if this is the most important revelation of God to man, it'd be a whole hell of a lot clearer, and it would also have a lot more evidence to back it up. And so I led to deconversion. And the lack of evidence is significant because if you don't have any evidence for something, it has a low probability of being true. That's the significance. We've proven this over and over, and you live your life this way. You don't go into pizza joints expecting hamburgers because there's a lack of evidence that they make hamburgers. You live your daily life. It would be stupid of you to go up to an electric charging station and try to think that gas is going to come out of it for your car because of the lack of evidence that electronic charging stations produce gasoline. Okay? I mean, the idea that the lack of it is one of the silliest ones I've heard, and it tells me that it came from apologetics. It absolutely tells me it came from apologetics because they know that the lack of evidence is stacking up against them. And so they're trying to get this idea that the lack of evidence has anything to do with anything. And that's coming over into the life of Christ. It's coming over into the ideas of the existence of God. So they're postulating gods that hide themselves. We would never know if an omnipotent deity hid himself. We would never know. Well, then the evidence for that would be atheism. Okay, so you should be looking at atheists and going, this God has got them bamboozled, that he doesn't exist. He's doing a good job bamboozling them. And I'm sorry, it sounds like another apologist trope here. It sounds like another apologist trick. And so, this whole week I've been talking about the life of Jesus and different things and doctrines and so on and so forth. The only break I had for that was talking about confession on Wednesday. And people have been adding these objections, and then, did God really kill his kid? Well, then you obviously don't believe Isaiah 53:10 is talking about Jesus because it says that God was pleased to crush him. You don't believe then in the fact that God planned this out. I mean, the premeditation for the end of Christ's life on the cross is a premeditated plan by God, is it not? And if he's doing, just because the Romans actually did the spear thing and Jesus may have volunteered to be killed, doesn't change the fact that God is still the one that premeditated the whole thing and had him killed. Okay? I'm sorry, if a godfather has one of his hitmen order the killing of somebody, is not the godfather still culpable for the crime? And it doesn't matter that the guy that they wanted to kill, wanted to be killed, doesn't change anything. It's still a murder. Okay, it's still a homicide. Okay, and God still planned the homicide of his son. He planned it out. He ordered the events according to Christian theology, and had him killed. This is some of the comments that come up in a week like this, and It's studying the life of Christ that led me to how nonsensical these arguments are. Well, the lack of evidence for Jesus' life doesn't prove he didn't exist. Granted, but some of the events aren't even verified at all. In fact, all of them. It's all hearsay and would not hold up in a court of law. If you tried to prove Jesus lived with the Gospels, any good prosecutor would say that's hearsay. We don't know where that came from. Well, objection sustained, inadmissible. And that's the proof of the life of Jesus. The whole thing, all four Gospels. Anybody with any decency would be able to show how this is hearsay. And the sad part is all of you are believing hearsay as fact. You're believing gossip and rumors as fact. And that's how the life of Christ killed it for me. I was done. And the lack of evidence is significant. Okay? Because, I prefer to have characters in history that have more evidence than this. Okay? And there's plenty of them. And, this whole idea that God didn't kill his kid and all the kind of things that I postulated this week have just come up in spades, and it amuses me now. I'm not trying to be rude, but it amuses me because it's like, dude, and it saddens me too. I really have a lot of empathy for people that are still in the faith because I know the delusion of it because I was a victim of it for years. I was indoctrinated into it. I was played into it, and I feel very sad for you. A lot of people go, I feel sad for you losing your faith. And I'm like, I feel sad for you that you still have yours. Okay, and that's just truth of it. And so, I'm just, telling you why this doesn't work for me and why the lack of evidence is significant, because it is significant. And to say that it isn't seems like you're trying to dodge the fact that there's no evidence for your claims. Okay, we're going to fall back onto the axiom. Any claim made without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Okay? Because evidence is the key thing. Do you have data to back it up? Do you have a way of proving the truth of something, that it conforms to reality, has predictive power, has, the things that we associate with truth? No, you can't. And now you're admitting it, but you're trying to say it's insignificant. That's kind of weird to me. And that applies to the life of Christ, it applies to the existence of God, it applies to pretty much everything that I talk about on this channel. And that's kind of the sad part for me. Well, that's just kind of my pontification for the week. It's been an interesting week doing Holy Week, and I appreciate all the likes, shares, and subscribes. All of you guys have been diligent building the channel, and thank you for that. I appreciate that. I also want to give a shout out to my members, as always, to my citizens, to my Rabyd citizens. These are the guys that make a lot of what I do worthwhile, and it really, really helps me out in doing videos that I know, when I sit down to do a video, there's always the psychology of, now, is this going to get enough views to make me some money? But I don't worry about that with my deconversion ones because of the members. You guys make that happen. And if you want to also be a part of making that happen, of keeping me doing those deconversion videos that help people deconvert, I'll continue to do them, but it just eases my mind a little bit that it's worth it. It's worth it. So thank you very much for those that contributed, and, consider it for yourself. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around and then it's over. There is no resurrection from the dead. There is no afterlife. There's no good evidence for either one of those things. In fact, there's no evidence at all. And so I would rather see you live your life, take your time, your money, your opportunities, giving it to yourself, to the people that you love and care for, and to make this a better world. And don't waste it on the trappings of religion and faith, because that's a dead end. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.